This is the Liberal Europe podcast by ELF, bringing liberal ideas into the political debate, with Leszek Jezdrzewski and Ricardo Silvestra.
Hello, welcome to Liberal Europe. Today we're going to talk about the elections in Hungary, and it's going to be quite a monumental elections indeed. We might be seeing after 16 years, the end of the Fidesz party and the winning of the elections by the Tisza and Péter Magyar. And to discuss this and to talk about the chances for, I think, the most important elections in Central Europe since basically joining EU 2004, we have Edith Zgut-Przybylska, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology in the Polish Academy of Sciences and a visiting fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute. Edith, welcome very warmly to Liberal Europe.
Thank you for having me on board, Leszek. I'm happy to be here.
So, Edith, who is going to win in the Hungarian elections on April 12th?
Oh, wow. Okay, we just planned it right in the middle of it. So I keep getting this question for months over time. And, if you look at the polls, and if it were a normal election, let's put it this way, and a normal, established liberal democracy, right now, everybody will be just guessing like, okay, how big this win and victory of the opposition is going to be. Because the numbers and the polls, independent polling companies who are quite reliable with their methodology and everything, they're showing that there is going to be a huge victory for the opposition for the first time, since 20 years, since Viktor Orbán's party started to dominate the Hungarian political system since 2006. But here's the tricky part. This is not a normal election, and this is not a normal established liberal democracy. This is a hybrid regime, which means that no matter what the polls say, and the polls might be correct, that the opposition has this huge support and this new oppositional leader, Péter Magyar, could galvanize and unify, the dissatisfied people behind Tisza, still the mobilization capacity of a hybrid regime like Viktor Orbán's, this is something that you cannot just easily measure precisely with, the classic polling methodology. And what I mean by that, the regime is having different kind of methods to mobilize and to reach out to people who would not necessarily want to even vote for anybody, right? So probably many people in Poland already also saw this new documentary movie, which is called The Price of a Vote, which shows very meticulously presents how the regime is intimidating and pressing and pushing people to mobilize them, to make them vote for Fidesz. Some of them would do this for money. Some of them would do this for a pack of potato. Very, very vulnerable people who can get easily threatened and intimidated. For some of them, it's even a family security issue because, childcare services are threatening them to take away their children if they're not supporting Viktor Orbán. So there is this thing which is very difficult to measure, within these conditions. And there are other things which might eventually help Viktor Orbán to catch up a little bit in the polls, at least to minimize a bit this kind of defeat that might eventually happen for him on Sunday. The way how they rewrote the rules of the elections are also helping Fidesz in this regard. For instance, double Hungarian citizens, who are living in Serbia, in Romania, in historical former territories of Hungary, they're traditionally voting for Fidesz. And the way how they created these regulations, it's that there is a lot of window for abusing these votes. So these people are going to vote via postal service. They cannot vote anyhow else. Even that people remained on the registration list, so locals can just misuse their kind of ballots and send it back, and these people are not even alive anymore. So there are different ways of how eventually the party can also get extra mandates, not to mention the winner compensation that is also logged in the electoral system, and the gerrymandering, which happened in the last couple of years, which also created this kind of, let me put it very simply way, Tisza needs more people to win an electoral district than Fidesz does. So the way how it has been designed is this. And at the end of the day, in order to get a simple majority for Tisza, the party needs to get 4/6% more support of the votes than Fidesz, just to flip it over, just to have a simple majority. So it's a very difficult system, very difficult conditions, as the literature says. When it comes to hybrid regime, the opposition would need to have a different, more engaging, like tremendously dedicated approach in order to win the elections, because of the conditions, which is extremely tilted playing field at the moment.
So how do we know, let's say it's Sunday night or then it's Monday morning, do we know anything about would we know anything about the results, or do we need to wait much longer because of the votes coming in from abroad? And would we know anything based on, there is no exit polls, right? So
No.
do we need to wait for a couple of days until we actually know what happens in the elections? Or do you think that early results would give us an indication that it's going to be like, let's say, the huge majority for Tisza, regardless what's going to happen with those the single mandate districts? Or do you think that it's going to be a sort of celebration and claim of the victory by one side or another, or it's going to be more subdued and we need to wait a couple of days before we know anything?
It's a fair and very important question, and I'm happy that you mentioned the overall what's coming from abroad, because it's extremely important. Not only those that I mentioned, double citizens in near abroad countries, but also, for instance, me, I'm going to also vote as a Polish resident, but a Hungarian citizen. I'm going to vote in Warsaw, and this means that my vote is also going to travel, just like many other people who live elsewhere. So we would need to wait for those. The level of registration of these votes is very high, which also means that this time the engaging in politics of Hungarian people has reached the point of 1989. We haven't been witnessing it for quite some time. So there has been quite a lot of mobilization from the side also of the opposition. And given that it takes some time, it might eventually take a couple of days to count these. And for sure, the votes that are coming from abroad, they're going to be finalized and counted. Like, I think it takes like a week, so it's going to be finalized around Saturday. But, and it's a big but, if there is going to be an unprecedented level of turnout, if it's going to be above 75%, the last time it was around 70, and it was already like huge in Hungarian context. If it's going to be higher or even higher, which we don't know yet, like some polls, polling companies would say that it's going to go beyond 75%. It also indicates that there could be a flip over, and like Tisza could win with a very big majority, because it's also logged in the system. And then we're going to probably know a little bit more on Sunday. Still, we would need to wait for every, casted ballot coming from abroad, but then it's going to be probably a little bit more obvious situation, and there is going to be a lot more celebration on the street for those who voted for the opposition. But if it's going to be extremely close, then it might not even take a week. It might even take a month, to figure out what is going to happen. Because if it's a scenario of laser thin, close race, then it would mean that there is going to be, if Tisza is going to win just by the little, then Fidesz is going to contest for sure, and the other way around. So there is going to be recounts, probably even, repeated elections in a couple of constituencies. And if that's the case, the courts are going to do back and forth with these kind of issues for weeks, and it would super probably not only procrastinate the inauguration of the new government, but it could eventually lead to some sort of a very unstable situation. Emotion is going to run high. It's very hard to predict how it's going to look like, but probably there's also going to be social mobilization. Hopefully it's not going to result in violence on the street. I have to tell you that's, I think, a very positive thing about the last, 20 years or post-transition history of Hungary. The toleration of the Hungarian society towards violence is very low. So what happened in 2006 when we saw, after this leaked tape scandal of the former socialist government, and then people were on the street and there were like effective political violence, this has been remembered as really one of the worst historical point of Hungary. So, and this eventually led to the collapse of the government, if you remember. So this is something which I think both sides would want to avoid, but at the same time, the genie is out of the bottle already. There has been this kind of hyper extreme poisoning polarization for years. And we see that we have a country where more than 90% of the Hungarian people are going to vote either Tisza or Fidesz. And this is unprecedented. I mean, if you think about it, it's not even the case in the United Kingdom, which is a traditional two-party system. So what I just wanted to make the point here is that I think we reached the boiling point of hyperpolarization, which is not only unprecedented, but unbearable. Right? So it happens that the emotions are running very high. And this is why it's extremely difficult to predict how this is going to look like. And I think there is a lot of responsibility landing on the shoulder of these two leaders, not to fuel this, but to cool emotions and cool people down. Otherwise, no one knows what's going to happen on the streets of Hungary, really.
Right, it really looks like the ultimate battle, and we've seen recently the fueling of the emotions through the stills, I think, not really well explained explosives found in Serbia near the gas pipeline. We've seen recently leaked documents, governmental documents, showing how close, to put it mildly, are Viktor Orbán and Foreign Minister to his counterparts in Russia. Do you think that any of this last-minute sort of interventions will have influence on the vote, or basically everyone already knows which side they are going to go because it's been such a polarized elections anyway, and basically it's going to be the sort of referendum on the 16 years of Fidesz rule?
A little bit of all of this that you have just mentioned. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. What I think is the case for sure is that this unprecedented, this paradigm shift that Russia is obviously interfering into Hungarian elections, with everything that has been going on the last couple of weeks, increasing evidence of having intelligence-linked operations, information operation, disinformation campaign, whatever you can imagine. It shows that we haven't seen it before. And I think it indicates that this regime is really in trouble right now. So previously, it was not necessary to interfere to this extent because Viktor Orbán could easily win even the last election. And this was one of the biggest wins he had last time, because there were no potential challenger to step up and to mitigate this kind of regime machine, which is, as I said, it's like a vote delivering regime, which is very, very effectively capable of, through dependency structures and rewarding structures and different kind of things, to convince the people to vote for them. This is what we've seen in the last 16 years. This is also what my book is about, Informal Power in Hungary and Poland. I was trying to explain these mechanisms in a comparative way and also tell the story of PIS, how they were successful and then unsuccessful with it. But here we see that something has cracked in the last couple of years, and it has a lot to do also with the potential challenger. And that's why external interference is becoming more prominent. It's very difficult to measure the impact of this, but I think, as I said, the other way around, it shows how desperate the government became, that we eventually got to this point. And not only we saw Russia interfering, there was a lot of domestic, hybrid warfare tactics, which we couldn't even imagine years ago. Like if you think about how Hungarian authorities have been capturing Ukrainian cash convoy a couple of weeks ago. I mean, it was a very bad Netflix movie, right? I mean, we've been saying there's still a lot of ongoing investigation about it, but there was this Ukrainian cash convoy, which has been crossing the country for, decades. Even Viktor Orbán's cronies have been somehow contributing to this, and they have been beneficiary of, the transportation and everything, which was a normal thing to do. and couple of weeks before the election, they captured it on a Hungarian motorway, and like in an action movie, they were trying to show that this is some illegal cash transfer and this is to finance Tisza, which, there were absolutely no evidence about this, but they were trying to tell the story, the only story that this government is trying to win the election with, that Ukraine is trying to steal Hungarians' money. It's a corrupt regime which is threatening the security of the Hungarian people. And if you vote for the opposition, everybody is going to die for Ukraine. So this is the only message they're trying to push. Previously, it was just the message that you have to vote for Viktor Orbán because he is the man of peace, and the opposition wants to drag you into war. I think they noticed that it's not flying that well anymore because, there has been a lot of polls which were showing that a Hungarian society is having a kind of a war fatigue here. So we've been seeing it in 2022 and it's been ongoing. So just like in Poland, the previous campaign where PIS has lost power, they are pushing this message. And at the same time, the thinking of the Hungarian people is slightly bit elsewhere, right? So that they're more nervous about living standards, crumbling public services, that technically the government, the country is not functioning normally. They're nervous about being completely isolated within Europe, so that we're going to be new Belarus. So somehow this kind of propaganda pushing is not colliding, it's not really overlapping with the public sentiments right now. So that's how I see also the kind of the mistakes of this campaign. And there is a lot of things going on. I also see that it's not as efficient as we see in the polls as it used to be. But I think it's the most important thing is that the socio-economic environment has changed, and the Hungarian people started to be anxious about having a very corrupt regime, having a regime which is doing business with Moscow, doing business with China, fighting all the time with the European Union, isolating the country, that we are getting technically to the periphery of the European Union, which is already functioning as a multi-speed EU, and then we are completely out. Diplomats don't want to talk to, Hungarian government anymore, both in NATO and in the European Union. And this is what is fueling this kind of dissent and, this kind of rejection of the government. And then looks like that most likely the regime has just lost touch because, they still go this kind of down the road of pushing Ukraine. But back to just to very shortly answer your question, how it's going to effectively impact the outcome of the elections, we will see in 2 days. But so far, the polls were telling the story that it was inconsistent, not as efficient, and and the people would look elsewhere than Ukraine.
You mentioned that people in Hungary are basically tired of this deteriorating socioeconomic environment and also of the growing isolation of Hungary on the European stage. The Tisza party made a lot of promises also regarding the lowering the taxes and increasing the lowest pensions. Do you think that it is a sustainable program, considering especially the level of the state capture by Fidesz? Can they deliver on the promises, or is there a risk that, especially if they don't win constitutional majority, it might be possibly a short-lived government who will be not really able to deliver what they promised, and that is perhaps the biggest chance for Fidesz to regain power in less than 4 years?
It's another good question. The situation is the following. It really boils down to the majority of the new government. I mean, if it's going to be laser thin, it's going to be an uphill battle, and it's going to be extremely difficult for many reasons. One of them, as you mentioned, the captured institution as the environment itself, but not only. It's going to be also a lot more difficult to try to unfreeze the EU funds, which is the top priority of a Tisza government. If they're going to come to power, they're going to focus nothing only about this to try to unfreeze and to bring this money home, because the budget is also empty, and it's not going to be possible mathematically to deliver their promises and to elevate a little bit the living standards of the Hungarian people without this money. So if it's a constitutional majority, things are going to get a lot smoother, at least when it comes to, push things and make decisions and like launch, not only the reinstitutionalization of the democratic institutions and to change, the guard, but also to, I think the most difficult part is going to be to deal with the European Union, because, and let's make a comparison with Poland. In the case of Poland, it was also very difficult, but at the same time, the Polish government had a lot more time to do this. Tisza, in order to get the money, part of these EU funds and not to lose them forever, the deadline is August. So if you think about it, there is, let's presume there is going to be a new government in May. They're going to have like 2.5 months or like 3 in order to do this kind of magic trick that was Donald Tusk's government has been doing. And they had 1.5 year or even more. So there were more space to maneuver. That's one thing. The other thing is that the Polish government, of course, they had to, deal with the veto power of the president, which was difficult. But here the conditions are much different for the new potential government, because Viktor Orbán's government has been locking the most important laws as a cardinal law in the constitution, which means that you can only change them if you have a constitutional majority. I went through this a couple of days ago, and it's been mentioning 72 times the cardinal laws around 32 areas: property rights, party financing, media capture, many things that are essentially very important for the new government to change the regulations, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to present that this is a functioning rule of law country. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's going to be extremely difficult for the new government anyway. And if they don't have the constitutional majority, they would need to find a way to both stay legalistically tight so that they're not going around, the legal kind of, I would say, solutions. Probably maybe go to lower level of courts and to sue things and push things at private courts even. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to give you a seminar about the remedy possibilities, because for that would be great to have a lawyer here who knows how exactly this works. But for sure, the outcome of this procedure is going to be dependent on the majority of the new government, and we'll soon see how it's going to unfold.
So, Péter Magyar, who might be the next Hungarian prime minister, is the former Fidesz mid-level insider and seems extremely power-hungry and sort of self-centered. He was, I think he made his career through recording his then wife and publishing these recordings. I must say, he doesn't seem like extremely moral figure, from high ground moral figure. He's definitely charismatic. To what extent do you think that his personality is a chance and a risk for the sort of restoring Hungarian democracy? Do you think that it might be not replacing one, formerly liberal leader with another, not that liberal and not that perhaps determined to be working within the rule of law leader? Do you think that he might do whatever it takes to win with Orbán, which is great, but then he might do whatever it takes to stay in power, which is not so great?
I think you have been articulating the concerns of many Hungarians who probably at the beginning were not sure that they're going to vote for him. But let me just start by saying that the way how he created this majority behind him right now is, I think, the follow. People started to say him that he functions as a hammer. No matter what what kind of controversial issues were around him and how intensely the propaganda machine was trying to destroy him. I mean, can you imagine that for 2.5 years since he stepped out, you have heard nothing in over 80% of the Hungarian media that he's a traitor, that he's a female abuser, that he's a Ukrainian agent. Like, imagine what happened to Donald Tusk in TVP under PIS, this kind of propaganda, and make it 10 times more intense because, we have a different media structure here. So he has been having a lot of attacks in the last 2.5 years, and yet he could succeed, and technically nothing was destroying his image because people were so desperate to find somebody who is going to act like as a hammer, as I said, and hit the government very efficiently on corruption, on public services, on the crumbling country, on the extreme level of poverty, that the fact technically that Hungary just got not only the most corrupt country in the last 15 years, but also the poorest. I mean, this government has obviously broke a social contract, which was based on this. This is why they were so successful in the last elections. People knew that Viktor Orbán is corrupt and that the government is corrupt and they're stealing a lot of money. But it was this: we're stealing, but we're going to make it better for you too. So you're going to also be beneficiary of this system. As long as we are, you also going to get your fair share. And this is not the case anymore. And this is the story, I think, also that Péter Magyar was trying to tell here, that it's not only corrupt, but it's also getting very much worse for you guys. I mean, doesn't make sense anymore. So the one thing is the hammer thing, and this very legitimate question about, okay, but what if they're just going to do a different labeled autocracy here, right? Especially if they have constitutional majority. I think there might be some constraints for that wouldn't just allow this to happen and would make them to, even if it's tempting, they're not going to want to go down this road. And I just said 5 minutes ago, this is about, reestablishing and restoring Hungary's position within the European mainstream and getting the EU funds home. I mean, if you want to do this and if you want to play this game, that we are part of this family and we are not just, pissing on the table from the outside, you have to have a different strategic approach towards the European Union. So why would it make sense to do the same thing if you want to do the other thing to get the money and to be welcomed back into this family? So this is one thing. The other thing is that Tisza has been running on a ticket of restoring democracy. They're saying all the right things. If you look at their party program, you can see that Péter Magyar has been promising to introduce term limits, for instance, for the prime minister. So if he's going to be prime minister, he can get 2 cycles and then he leaves the stage. I mean, let's see if this is going to happen, but at least this is the promise. Together with promises like he wants to give veto powers to ministers within the government, which is another new thing. And I don't want to go into a political science seminar here, but you have to know that the Hungarian system, even before Viktor Orbán centralized his power, it's a very strongly prime minister specific system. It's called chancellery, parliamentary and democracy, just like in Germany, where the chancellor, who in this case is the prime minister, has an already wide space of power, right? So that he's running the show in the government. All the ministers are responsible for him. So it's already slightly bit centralized. And of course, it has been completely twisted and butchered, in the last 15 years. But what I see is that at least there are pronounced intentions that this government wants to do it differently. We will see how it goes. But as I said, if they want to go down this road of getting the money and restore Hungary's position within the European mainstream, that would be a very not smart strategic approach to further butcher or differently butcher the system and to create a big informal power around the new prime minister, just like Viktor Orbán did.
And just to end very shortly, it pains me to ask this question, but are there ways in which Viktor Orbán can actually steal the election, or if he loses the election, to block Péter Magyar from taking over the government?
I started this conversation with you about telling the story how vulnerable people are being forced and coerced to vote for the government. We don't know the exact amount of people who would need to vote like this. It's something we would really literally just see on Sunday, because as I said, methodologically it's very difficult to measure this. People wouldn't say, yes, I'm going to be forced to vote for this regime, although I didn't want to. So that's one thing. Why I'm emphasizing this is that we could have a situation in which Tisza wins the popular vote on the party list, and yet Fidesz is going to have more mandates in the parliament because of how the system is being designed. I briefly mentioned this winner compensation system, which means that due to gerrymandering and everything, it's very easy to flip over and to have allocating extra mandates for the government, which is for them, it's easier to get more mandates because how, the districts have been redesigned. They have more constituencies in the countryside where there are living less people. And Tisza is having constituencies where they're very popular, where they're more dense population. There are more people, so it's going to be more challenging for them. So this is one thing that could eventually lead to this very unprecedented and horrifying scenario that we wake up on Monday and everybody's going to see in television that, oh my God, Tisza won the popular vote and still Fidesz is going to have more mandates in the parliament. And how is it possible? They're not going to understand. They're going to say this was cheating, right? So this is not a normal situation. And you know what? Probably part of it is going to be huge cheating, as I just said. So it could be a very difficult situation. I don't even know what kind of implications it's going to get. But I think this is one of the scenarios where I hardly see that there's not going to be at least some tension on the streets because people will not be able to absorb what has been just happening. I really don't wish this for my country. I hope we're going to avoid this horrifying scenario. Another little bit more probable scenario is that it's going to be extremely close and there's going to be a lot of back and forth. They're going to challenge single constituencies and they were trying to flip the majority back for themselves. That's for sure. And yes, as I said, there's an enabling institutional environment with the captured courts, with the captured, different kind of agents of the state that might slow things down. But end of the day, if there is a majority, we see that it's an obvious Tisza majority. The president has to name the leader of the majority as the prime minister because, he can still pick Viktor Orbán and say like, okay, I choose Viktor Orbán. But 5 minutes later, the same parliament is going to impeach him or there's going to be this kind of mechanism when they say that we are withdrawing the trust from the prime minister and we're going to, just choose another one for ourselves. So, it's going to be extremely interesting to see how it all unfolds. And hopefully it's not going to take more than 1 week so that we're going to see something decisive about the final outcome of the election.
Well, let's hope that democracy wins on Sunday in Hungary. Edith Gut-Przybylska, thank you so much for being with us at Liberal Europe today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
This is all from me, Leszek Jażdżewski, and please tune in for Ricardo Silvestre next week. Until 2 weeks, goodbye.
You were listening to the Liberal Europe podcast by the European Liberal Forum. This podcast was co-financed by the European Parliament.